For the students, again, remember to submit your summary of the previous talks. And yeah, today's speaker is Dr. Courtney Falk, and he's an information security professional, and he got his master and PhD here from Purdue. And today we talk about malicious activities on social networks, and this is kind of a very hot topic, especially in these times.
Thank you very much, Antonio, and Jerry and Mike for helping set this up. Yeah, so this all connects back to a report that I'll include the link to. It's just something I started calling pod people. It's a poor attempt at being clever. I've just found that it's more useful to give something a name than a vague description. And so as I was doing my research, it became necessary to come up with something a bit more concise than vague spam redirection on social networks. Let's get the background out of the way. So as Antonio mentioned, I've done all 3 of my degrees at Purdue, most recently the PhD in the interdisciplinary program through CERIAS. My experience outside of education includes well, academia at Purdue, but also government, the federal US government, and in private industry. My current day job is principal security engineer, software engineer for GoDaddy. So it's a little different. It's the first time I've been in a place where security is not the product, which gives a different point of view on priorities and business. But all of this work I did independently. I found myself with a lot of extra time over the summer, as many other people had, and this is something that fell into my lap. This is a QR code that will take you to the GitHub repo where I've released the report. I'll include this and the URL again at the end, so you don't need to rush out and take a picture right away. But the key takeaways up front are, this is a spam redirection campaign. As near as I can tell, this is the first time all this campaign information has been collected in a single place, both in terms of the breadth across the sites and the depth in terms of the infrastructure that's been identified. Really, if you need an example of why credential stuffing is a problematic attack and why to use strong passwords, this could be your go-to. And it should also be a lesson that if your customers are your product, like a social network, you need to take care of them. Also, I'd like to note, I've gone to links to try and minimize and avoid identifying user accounts, and we will get to why that's important here in a minute. So over the summer, had some extra time, and this just happened to fall into my lap. And this is what I've done completely by myself. I haven't spent any money on it. So where I've used tools, I've used free community editions. I have hacked together some of my own code, and have not gotten a whole lot of feedback from the networks involved. So this is purely what I could find by myself on my own time. There was an excellent series of posts on DeviantArt where they were identifying large portions of this, but what they failed to identify was the breadth, that it was going across several different domains, and they didn't have a comprehensive list of all the indicators yet. So this is what happened. And I'm going to give this more as a war story. So this is more chronological as it happened, as I discovered things. If you want a more logical structure, that's exactly what the report is for. So today, this is essentially how I found things, in what order, and what I did about it. I use the Goodreads website quite a bit to track all the books that I've read, look for recommendations and that kind of thing. And what I noticed was people were liking some of my status updates. And that's happened before. I've connected with random people on Goodreads. But what struck me right away was, I thought, who cares? These were really dumb updates. one was like a reading progress update, or one was like a finished a book update. And I thought, no one really cares about this. And it happened once, and it happened again in a short amount of time, and that's what got my attention. So this pretty much fell into my lap. I was not proactively looking for this campaign at all. So what happened was I was curious, who are these people who are liking my boring reading updates? Are they bots or are they humans? So there have been some problems with bots and trolls on sites, to include Goodreads before, but it seems mostly confined to either trolling or padding. But you can hire people to pad your book with good reviews, or sandbagging. You can pay people to go and give negative reviews to competitors' book, per se. So I started looking at these people, and I identified 4 right off the bat. But by looking through them, it became obvious pretty quick that at least some of them were actual people. With a bot, I would expect to have empty profiles. I would expect to have gibberish. But as an example, this is a very fleshed out profile. This person has hundreds of friends. They've read a lot of books. These books are thematically coherent. And there was enough information that I was able to track this person down on the internet and identify where they worked. I reached out. That person did not respond, to which I don't blame them. If a random person questioned me on the internet asking if I had problems with my account, I probably wouldn't respond either, but I was hoping to get an affected user's insight into this problem. So right away, I was starting from the position that, pardon me, at least some of these accounts are legitimate people's accounts, but they've been either completely taken over or had data inserted into it. So if you look on this, the black is all the censoring to avoid personal information. The red is really what caught my attention. So not every profile on Goodreads has a website. This one did. And for this gentleman who comes from East Asia but works in Europe, he had a .ru website. And right there, that was a little too weird. That was too many different things in one place. But what really was interesting was that red box you see it in 2 points. The subdomain on that website was his Goodreads user string. And that's what clinched it for me. There was too much of a coincidence. And that is one of the key indicators of this attack, is that when someone takes over an account, they take their unique user string and create a subdomain on one of their pieces of infrastructure, one of the domains they control. So these affected profiles are all going to have a URL inserted into them. And this URL redirects to another site. And when I began, they all redirected to the same place. And it was called Your Dating Space 2, I think it was at the time. There was a previous domain and a future domain to the same site. It advertised itself as Dirty Tinder, which Tinder is after my time, but my understanding is that's kind of a redundancy. But it was kind of a skeezy, low energy website. It was doing really sketchy things, like the first time I would hit it. And I have to say that if you're going to probe weird websites, do it inside a virtual machine. Don't do it on the box you rely on to get your work done. So that's step 1. I eventually moved on to using a tool called AnyRun, which is a sandbox system. It's cloud distributed, so you can hit it from multiple points. So what would happen is, the first time you'd hit it, it would take over 20 seconds to resolve. The second time you hit it, it would resolve right away, which suggested to me it was, 1, it was caching the hit, and 2, it was probably trying to profile my browser. But I was not able to actually get it to attempt an exploit and try to install malware. So I couldn't confirm in the end that this was an actual exploit kit they were trying to redirect me to. And as best as I can tell, it was basically spam, trying to get these people directed to these really skeezy websites. what was really interesting was there were 2 hard-coded GET parameters. So of all the affected redirection URLs I found, they all included the same pair of GET parameters. And what was interesting was you would have to include these to actually access the server. If you cut them off, the server wouldn't respond. But if you did include them, you could actually traverse through the directory structure, and I was able to pull back some of the code the site was using. So at that point, I found about 4 people. I've determined that they probably don't want their book-loving profiles to be directing to this dating, porn, skeezy website. So something bad is going on. At that point, I'm convinced that this is worth actually sinking more time into. But I don't want to waste my time. And this is, I figure, a great time to learn web browser automation. Selenium, it's something that's been on my to-do list for a long time. So what I decided was, I had this hypothesis that if all these affected accounts are liking the other updates randomly, then it might be that they're liking the same profiles. And that's how I found the first 4. I would go through the likes, and I would look for one that had multiple likes. And then you could just pivot through those and start finding them. So this was somewhat involved to develop with Selenium. Selenium's really a test tool. It's not designed to do large-scale web scraping. So at times I was maxing out the RAM usage on my box, and it was taking forever to run. So this was a very hackish bit of work. But this is what I found. Right off the bat, it validated what I was looking at. This was about 40, 50, 60 different like statuses that I identified. The likes are the blue squares. The known bads are the red circles. Those are accounts I've confirmed to have a redirector link in it. The green circles are the people who posted it. They're probably legit. They're probably okay. And then the yellow amber circles are suspect users. So on the left, you see it's usually a small cluster around each like. But in the middle, what gets called out on the right is exactly what I was looking for. You get these status of 4 status updates, and there are 3 suspect users that connect all those updates together. So they're the common link. And what are the odds that they know the same people and they're liking the same update? Goodreads has a reported number of 90 million users. I don't know active user base, but it seems unlikely that that would randomly happen. So this validated my approach, and I started running full bore with this. Any of these accounts that would show up in the middle, I would check the user profile, and if it had a web URL in its profile, then I would consider it bad. So I ran this a couple times, 4 iterations. I started with the 4 users I found by hand. I ran it once, found another 80, ran it again, 300, 1,000, 2,500. Around the 4th round, that took about 24, 36 hours to execute. And I called it quits at that point because I couldn't engineer it any better. And I had found enough data, I figured at that point. So at that point, I've got about 3,400 known bad accounts on Goodreads. I've started reaching out. I've been pinging Goodreads, hey, I found something bad. Hey, I've found something bad. If you could, get back to me. I've got this list of domains. And from that list, I dumped all the URLs in the profiles, and I started looking at just the root domain. So I had started identifying what are these common pieces of infrastructure that the attackers are using. I've come up with about 130 domains at this point. And then the thought occurred to me, well, who else is having this problem? I've identified 130 domains. I'm just going to start dropping them in to DuckDuckGo and see what comes up. And this is not scientific. DuckDuckGo is not going to, they're not reporting all the hits that come back from Goodreads. Not every account, even affected account, is listed. And these are cached results. So they're already out of date. But it could give me a problem. It could give me rather an idea of the scope of the problem. So what happened? Who did I find that was affected other than Goodreads? Basically everyone. As I started going through some of these different domains, I would find some of the same victims every single time, and then I would start digging deeper, and then I'd find really, really esoteric social network sites. So it's not just the big ones like Facebook and Twitter, although they are definitely affected. There was a Russian language car website. There was a Klub, an Iranian language general purpose Facebooky type sites I'd never heard of. So it was somewhat of a learning experience that way. And I ended up finding over 70 different sites. And what I considered success for this was if I could take a result from DuckDuckGo and independently verify that it was currently affected, if I saw one of these domains, then I would consider that network affected. Otherwise, if I could get 3 unique results from DuckDuckGo, then I would also consider affected, because what had happened was some networks had already started remediating these attacks. So Foursquare, I know, was already ahead of the curve. When I contacted them, they had said, yeah, we know we're working on filtering that out. So I didn't have a whole lot to tell those guys specifically. But not every site was filtering it out quite as quickly as Foursquare was. And at this point in the investigation, I dropped the idea that I was going to be able to reach out individually to every social network that was affected. That was my ideal at the beginning. But once I started getting 50 and 60 affected networks, that was not going to be feasible. What was interesting was that the attack presented differently across different social networks. So on Goodreads, it was a link inserted into the user profile where it would get rendered as, an anchor tag, so you could click on it. Like Foursquare, it was inserted into the username, so there was no anchor tag. You would actually, I guess they were expecting the user, victim user, to see it in another profile, copy it, paste it into the browser, and then view that site, which is a pretty involved attack. So I'm curious about the success ratio of that. Some websites were doing weird things with the puny code. So that www was not the Latin W character, it was the Cyrillic W character. If you put them side by side, the Cyrillic gets rendered slightly higher. So if you know what to look for, you can tell that it's not right, but it's a visually similar attack. And then some sites had a text lure included with it. Goodreads, I think I found that on one, but by and large, it was just the link. So if you look in the report, I include every site that I could verify was affected, in what way it was affected, so like these criteria. And this affected a large number of languages too, so it wasn't just English. Found several Russian, Farsi, French, Portuguese, Chinese, Japanese. It was a real smorgasbord. So the second question I came up with was, how are these attackers getting on the sites? And the 2 likely hypotheses I came up with were, one, they're hacking into the site. Either they've got an exploit for some of the software on that website stack, or they've found a flaw in the authentication, something like that. So looking for myself, I took my email address and I jumped on Have I Been Pwned? And specifically what I was looking for was Goodreads, because if Goodreads had been pwned, hopefully it would show up, and I could link that back. It didn't show up. I found several other email addresses for friends, and strangers sometimes embed their email addresses on Goodreads. So I checked those accounts too, and no one came up as having a data breach for Goodreads. So that seemed unlikely at that point. And also, as the number of affected sites grew, it became apparent to me that it was unlikely that there was one exploit that would get access to all the different software stacks. And it was also unlikely that there would be 70 different exploits that an attacker would bother to write. And my second hypothesis was this is credential stuffing. So it would not require the level of technical effort and knowledge as opposed to developing an exploit. It would require roughly the same level of skill that I'd put into my Selenium work. They would just have to profile the website, look at the DOM, know which fields to fill out, and from there, put it in a loop, drop in a list of user credentials, and just go with it. So the fact that so many different websites were affected really supported that. And some of the reporting I saw suggests that credential stuffing can expect a 0.5% success rate. So that also loosely supported the credential stuffing, because otherwise you would expect like everyone on Goodreads to suddenly have a bad account, or sorry, a bad URL inserted into their profile. So a counter to that might have been, maybe they were staying low due to OPSEC, but these factors supported the hypothesis of it being credential stuffing much more than actually hacking into each site individually. So here's the rough structure for how I was looking at this campaign. There's 3 phases. There's how they gained the access, putting the links in, and then where the links redirect to. I am roughly considering these as 3 separate threat actor groups at this time. I don't have strong evidence that it would be one threat actor conducting all phases. So until such time, I would consider these 3 steps to be conducted as 3 different groups. So one group would gain access, sell the accesses they've secured to the people who insert the links. The people who insert the links would then get paid for whatever hosting Skeezy site wants to be redirected to. What was interesting on Goodreads were those random links, the random status likes. And as I started dumping them out, I noticed a pattern. So I noticed that they would seem to happen at regular intervals. And to test this, I basically plotted it out. And I found about 40 users out of a data set of about 600 I had built. And each had 4 likes, and each of those likes were exactly 2 hours apart. And I plotted them, and this is what I ended up with. The vertical axis doesn't mean anything. It's just there to demonstrate that there are 40 different likes in each of these phases, in each of these cycles. And as I looked at that, I was reminded of Hunt for Red October when the sonarman on the Los Angeles declared that's got to be man-made. So what's interesting is the threat actor behind this group is able to build and maintain a certain amount of C2 and automation that they can remotely control these accounts. So then I started wondering, how far back does this go? I have about 130 bad domains using Risk IQ and their passive DNS, their historical DNS. I was able to look up the IPs that these mapped to over time. And these were when the domains were initially registered. So you can see it goes back all the way to November 2009. So that's much further back than I had expected. And there was like this steady, slow accumulation of URLs, and then this sudden burst of activity towards the end of 2018. So that's interesting. And there's also that gap there I can't quite explain around 2017. I don't know if that means they went dormant, or if perhaps there's a whole subset of activity I haven't found yet. And these were how the domains and IP addresses map to one another, and left is the entirety of the graph, and the right is a focused look on the middle. And what's interesting is that there seems to be possibly two different sets of things going on. On the left, you could see the red dots are the IP addresses and the blue dots are the domains. So on the left, you could see towards the periphery are domains that seem to have changed and bounced between a lot of different IP addresses. And then towards the middle, you get a small set of IP addresses that have been mapped to by many, many different domains. And I have not yet developed a strong hypothesis for what that might be. It might be possibly even multiple groups maintaining different pieces of infrastructure. So there could be some interesting DevOps implications for that. The attacks have also been changing over time. So this is from Hattana, which is a Japanese language social network I found. I don't speak Japanese, but they were inserting English-like text. And here they're doing something where they've been inserting it both into the user profile and they've been adding posts to the user. And what you can see is they've changed domains that they've been using. They've used the same user's account, which is the red censored box. And at the beginning, the first time it's linode kjs.ru, and then later they switched to 18sexy.biz. So there's been some amount of updating, some amount of shifting over time as this has gone on. These attacks, specifically, I've traced back to about late 2019, although the DeviantArt posts suggest that they were seeing similar activity on DeviantArt going back to late fall 2018. Another interesting thing to note is that some users appear to have reclaimed their accounts. I've seen this specifically on Goodreads. People will come back and you'll start to see they've been gone since 2011. All of a sudden they're adding new books, which is not an activity the attackers do, and or they've removed the link. I find it interesting when the accounts have new activity, but the links remain, which suggests that not every user is aware of what's going on with their profile. And that was also specifically why I was interested in speaking to the guy who was affected, or anyone else for that matter who's been affected. I wanted to know if the password had been changed, if the attackers had made some attempt to prevent the user from reclaiming their attack. And I cannot establish any of that firmly yet. This was a kind of out of the blue development that I'm still wrapping my head around. And it didn't make a lot of sense, but it suggests that there have been multiple kind of discrete phases to the attack. So what I'm calling out here is the bottom link in red. That's the account name. So this is a WordPress blog. They've created it with this .xyz account, the URL as the account name. But what seems to have happened was that was harvested from an earlier phase in the campaign. So they found an account where that was the username. And then they were able to use that with user credentials and develop something. Because what they've done for the redirection URL is that username, the SPNCPXYZ, that was the first phase's redirection. And now they've added the .ru domain to it. So that's a second phase. And that wasn't the only place that I found it, because I ended up stumbling upon some leaked Telegram cracked accounts. That's the gray box. That would be the account names and the passwords. I'm happy to report that I checked and that these accounts appear to have fixed themselves. Because what you see is some of these users down towards the bottom, the sexy-ru, and then you can see they've added one of the .klub nonsense domains to the end. And Telegram specifically has been the victim of a couple different data breaches in the last year. So it's possible that the first breach happened, those credentials were used in credential stuffing, the username was changed, and then the second breach happened. And this new breach has the affected usernames from the first breach in it. And what's interesting is this is a fairly small data sample. It's not representative. It's about 40 accounts, but about half of them are affected. And that's a much higher success rate than I would expect with credential stuffing, which suggests that they have a large number of Telegram account credentials, and it's fairly recent. Most people have not changed them yet. This is a piece that is not in the report yet. In the next day or two, I'm hoping to update the report. I'm going to put this slide deck on GitHub with the original report, and I'll include new information like this. Using the domain to IP mappings from RiskIQ that I showed you this chart of earlier, I decided just to figure out how much have they been spending. And I was just looking at the domain registration and the hosting costs. So based on the TLD, the cost varies slightly, but the TLDs that I've recorded, they're spending over $300 a year to maintain those registrations. And they're spending about $12.75 a year for hosting. And as I look at the math, it doesn't make sense that they would spend less on hosting to date than yearly. So I'm going to go back to my Excel spreadsheet and figure out why that would be the case. But this gives you an idea for the sunk cost that these attackers have in it. At least $1,600 a year. That's not a huge amount, but that is significant enough that they seem to be invested in it. It doesn't also include, I'm assuming the C2 systems are different, that they're not using the same boxes for redirection that they are for command and control. I'm also not factoring in development time, and they've obviously spent some amount of money on development time. And this is something else. It's not specific to the campaign, but it's a lesson that I learned by exploring. I started finding the same user accounts affecting multiple social network sites. Tumblr was the biggest problem source. So people would compromise Tumblr accounts and insert badness. And there's about 5 different sites I found that basically just repackaged Tumblr. So you can browse to them and see their ads and read Tumblr without being a member. But what happens is they are embedding the same bad links that the attackers put into Tumblr originally. So Tumblr, a couple others. This is kind of like a free amplification of that attack. Foursquare, some of their data gets consumed by other websites. Untapped is a social network all about beer. And I found Foursquare data being linked in travel websites. And what happens is Foursquare has already taken the steps to remediate these attacks. So the affected user accounts are isolated and or fixed. That is not the case for the sites that have basically consumed and cached that Foursquare data. They are not actively going back and checking on the status of these user accounts. So this is a nod to some of the more military-minded threat intelligence people I've worked with in the past, like courses of action. Where do we see this going? And usually you talk about most dangerous and most likely. So what's most dangerous? What's the worst that can come from this? I mean, so they control redirection. They can redirect whatever they want. If someone came in and said, hey, direct to my rig exploit kit, I mean, they could be exploiting and gaining boxes tomorrow. Or it is October 2020 in the United States. The memories of 2016's election are still fresh. These people have demonstrated that they have access to these accounts. They are able to modify data and insert data at will. Some of these sites, they're creating posts. There's really nothing to prevent them from turning this into disinformation, other than a real willingness. I don't see either of these as being terribly realistic. Well, the disinformation is the least realistic, because at this point it's a little late to try and sway a campaign. And I see the same things repeated over and over in these text lures. So it's not that they're trying a whole lot of different things. The exploit kit is something I worry a lot about, just because we don't know where this is going. And they've been changing where they redirect. Some of the original sites that they redirected to now redirect to 127.0.0.1. So that's kind of an acknowledgement that, hey, you caught us, we can't use this domain anymore. The most likely courses of action, though, are they're probably going to maintain this as a spam campaign. I don't think they've stopped gaining accesses. I know they've been losing accesses over time. And they've shown a recent history of adding infrastructure. So I would expect that to keep changing. And even if all the infrastructure that I've listed as a part of this report were taken out tomorrow, I expect they would just start the grind and accumulating new domains at that point. So what have I done personally to keep moving with this? I started notifying the sites. As I mentioned, I gave that up once I realized the scope, and I don't speak enough languages. I gave this data to US CERT to give them some kind of notification before the report went out. And I did reach out. All these domains seem to be currently hosted with the same registrar. And I did reach out to the registrar, and I said, hey, you've got a lot of bad stuff going on here. Is there anything you can do about it? I mean, they basically said no. Attribution. Attribution is something I have kind of an uncomfortable relationship with. It's done frequently. I think it's seldomly done well. If you want to see attribution done well, the Mandiant FireEye APT1 report, that's excellent. Robert Lee runs a ICS company, a security company out of Maryland called Dragos. He speaks at length on attribution, so he has some better formed opinions on it. But I know people were going to ask, so I decided to just throw out some characteristics, if not attributions, for this campaign. With moderate confidence, I would say that they're skilled DevOps engineers. They obviously have the ability to automate large numbers of accounts. And what's interesting is that stopped back in July. So maybe it was an experiment. Maybe they determined that it raised the OPSEC profile too much and they wanted to go under the radar, but that's how I got involved. With high profile, this is a criminal spam operation. It doesn't seem to be nation state. The sophistication, the skill with the DevOps suggests someone who is able to invest some amount of money and some amount of time in this. With high confidence, I would say that these are Russian speakers. So in the image over on the left, this is an example of one of the text lures that come up. It's kind of English. It's broken in several different ways. They insert Cyrillic characters in place of Latin characters. I've seen the same text with the T's rendered in Cyrillic versus Latin and stuff like that. So it might be partly an attempt to avoid scanning, not very effectively. But then they do things like the dotted circle highlights Krasotki, which I think translates to like beauty, like a beautiful person, a beautiful woman, I'm assuming. So there seems to be a lot of support for the fact that these are Russian speakers. They certainly have comfort using Cyrillic key sets. I will only say with a moderate confidence that they would be Russian nationals. Russian is a world language. The fact that they appear comfortable and operate on a daily basis in Russian is not sufficient to say that these are Russians. This is something entirely new that I tacked on at the end. This is not in the original report, but I've identified several dozen WordPress blogs that appear to be affected in the same way. They have the same redirection link infrastructure. So that's very interesting that the indicators are connecting these. It may or may not be credential stuffing, because over the last year or two, there have been a series of vulnerabilities for WordPress come out. There are companies, I spoke to one out of Romania, that make their business in remediating these WordPress compromises. So it may be a different TTP tactics and procedures, techniques and procedures that attackers use. So it might be the same people, it might be a collaboration between two different. If I can develop a better understanding, I would like to write a second report that talks more about this in depth. But as of yet, I'm still kind of uncomfortable with some of the links between the two. So in the end, I have advice for users and I have advice for people who run these websites. Users, use strong passwords, but most importantly, don't use the same password across multiple websites. That is what enables credential stuffing to work. They just need, what is that, 0.5% of people to do it, and their attack succeeds. If you have an account you don't use anymore, delete it. Don't leave that cruft out there on the internet. And what I found was, don't assume you know what permissions, what sharing permissions your account is operating under. I thought mine were pretty locked down, but when strangers started liking my status updates, I realized that things were set a little too public. So I went back and changed that. For sites, similarly, look at how you treat old inactive accounts. Lock them, maybe on a trial basis. There's a lot of hesitancy on the part of these sites to delete the accounts outright, but you need to do something, especially for accounts you can confirm to be affected by this campaign. Use multi-factor authentication. There's plenty of support libraries out there to help with that now. I've released the entire list of redirector domains along with the report, so you can pull down that CSV and scan for them right off the bat. But even more than that, there are some of these TLDs that are just so highly polluted, like .xyz, that maybe you just shouldn't let them in at all. And maybe make one or two people angry, but the amount of pain that would save you would be worth it. So thanks again for all the tools and resources that I used free of charge to make this happen. RiskIQ, AnyRun, and Selenium. And special thanks to my proofreaders, Dr. Josiah Dykstra and Emil Karimi. Congratulations, new dad, Emil. Hopefully you get some sleep soon. So that's what I found today. It continues to develop. Even yesterday, 2 days ago, I found Reddit. I thought Reddit was safe for a long time, and then I finally found an affected account. The QR code on your screen takes you to that URL on your screen, and that's where I'll be updating the report and adding this presentation. If you have specific questions, I set up that email account specifically for this campaign. But I would also be happy to take any questions now.
Okay, thanks, Courtney. That was great. I was intrigued by your title from the very beginning. So thank you for sharing your work with us. As usual, it's brilliant, and hopefully we'll get some interest here. I don't see too many written questions. There was one individual that we may want to open his mic. He had a couple of comments on. Krasi, would you like us to open your microphone?
Yes, I responded,
okay.
But
you are. You're open. So.
Hey, thank you for the presentation. So I was just going to comment first, Krasotki, if it's written with A, it may be the Ukrainian version. If it's written with O, then it's probably the Russian one. But one thing I was going to mention also is that Ukrainians use a lot of Latin letters mixed with Cyrillic, which is actually part of the language. And when I say Latin letters, they're technically Cyrillic letters, but they look a lot like the Latin letters. So that's one thing that may be a pointer. But again, with all digital things, you never know when you're dealing with a false flag. So, you know, take it for what it is. The other thing is 127.0.0.1 very often is used just to park something while you're not using it. Maybe because it was just maybe acquired as a resource and you haven't set up a particular redirector for that thing, or maybe you want to take it out of rotation. And in some very rare cases, I have seen it also when somebody does very targeted campaign for very short amounts of time, they would point it to something and then they would withdraw it and effectively use the TTL of the DNS records. And then once this thing expires, then it automatically shuts down.
Good points. Yeah, specifically to the 127.0.0.1, that domain had been in active use previously, and I had seen it, and it had been seen in conjunction with some of these WordPress sites. And then, so yes, it currently been parked. What was also interesting was that domain was your-datingspace.com. That got parked, and what I was seeing was your-datingspace2.com, which suggests it was the same person. They pointed to some of the same IP addresses at that time. Thank you for pointing that out about the orthography, the spelling. What I've actually saw is both versions. I saw Krasaki with A's and Krosaki with O's. So yeah, I hadn't considered Ukrainian separately. I guess mentally I was lumping it together with Russian, which is probably politically incorrect.
Well, actually, it's not, because if you think about it, a lot of the Ukrainians, their primary language actually is Russian, because a lot of them are, their heritage is Russian. Stalin moved a lot of people around there. So some of them actually do prefer Russian. Some of them would speak Ukrainian. There was a point where also some of the Ukrainian ones would not even want to speak Russian right after the changes in '91. So yeah, it's a mix. You don't know what you're getting.
Yeah, and as someone who speaks neither Ukrainian nor Russian, that's difficult for me to determine between. Ironically, we do have populations of Ukrainian and Russian here in my town, so maybe I can find someone I can ask. There was something else to your point that I was going to mention. Oh, some of the affected Russian sites are pretty prominent too. So I picked on that Russian car site, but Odnoklasniki, OK.ru, I found affected accounts there, and VK, vcontact.com, I found affected accounts there too. And actually some of the domains I found, you could almost write a regular expression to like capture large numbers of these. There's a large number that begin with OK and then a 2-letter sequence .ru. And so there may also be an additional layer here where they're going for visually deceptive domain names. So the guy I showed at the beginning, I think his domain was okkl.ru. And so one of the things I started considering early on was that this could be an attempt to create a visually deceptive account like this guy has an Odnoklasniki account, which seemed odd because he was from East Asia living in Europe. That he would somehow have made the triangle through Russia seemed unlikely. That's kind of what got me on that angle. And it's not just OK. Several of the domains begin with klub, and klub.com is a Farsi Persian language website. So that I've not established that they're trying to do this visually deceptive domain name attempt, but it was an interesting coincidence. And klub, the Persian language site, was also affected coincidentally.
Well, it's interesting also if you think about from geopolitical point of view, because of the sanctions, there's a lot of Russians that do business in Iran. Actually, they're buying a lot of software from Russia currently. So I don't know if that has some connection. For example, if there's also a nation-state nexus to this operation, because a lot of the Russian operations are actually criminal operations that here and there take input from the government, because it's much cheaper to use somebody that already has developed criminal infrastructure than to develop your own. So there could be some additional nexus there that would explain why Iranian sites are affected.
In previous threat intelligence reporting I've done, I've cited different reports that have talked about that as a pattern seen with Russian nation-state connections to criminal hacker groups, and it's also a pattern seen with Iranian groups in terms of the criminals being used as kind of a cutout or a false front with that pre-built infrastructure in place. That's not a connection that I would be comfortable making in this case. I have not found enough information to support a conclusion like that, but it is interesting, and it's one of the more compelling threat intelligence stories out there.
Yeah, and that's something for other people to deal with in the commercial space. We don't need to go there. The other thing on 127.0.0.1 is to consider if they became too successful too quickly and the redirect infrastructure is unable to service the requests. I've seen that with botnets happen from time to time. It
could be. They may be monitoring it, because I think at one point I did get my home IP blocked. Even with my VM, it was using my home IP, which I finally decided was a risk worth it for investigating, and eventually it stopped responding. But I could still get responses by using AnyRun, which maintains a number of different access points in the cloud. And that's also, I mentioned, that dirty Tinder site. They would respond in German or Dutch or French or Spanish, depending on which GeoIP you came from.
Another thing to consider, because they already exhibited the ability to do dynamic DNS redirects when you were showing the double redirect, where they have one domain with dashes that is actually the host part of another domain. That means that they probably using something like Power DNS or something else to do dynamic DNS, but they could also be using this for fingerprinting. I've used that quite a lot, actually. So they may be inserting slightly different DNS names for different targets and see which one is resolved. And this is how also they can maybe pick up you versus other people and so on, depending on what's inserted where.
It could be. Yeah, and I don't think I mentioned it, but the fact that they were using the user's ID basically as a subdomain, my conclusion was that was basically deconfliction, and as a way to track where these hits are coming from. This maps uniquely to Goodreads, so we can tell that our Goodreads campaign is more successful than OK or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
We have a question from.
Yes. Go ahead, Antonio. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I just want to say, so we have a Q&A question. Do you have any intent or interest in pursuing the redirectors with sandbox VMs and all versions of browsers to get some more data on potential exploit kits?
That was what I was trying to do with AnyRun. So any.run, it's both the name of the site and the URL you can go to. It's a Russian product. It's pretty robust, and that's what I was doing. It would allow me, it would spin up a sandbox, and it would allow me to choose from about 3 browsers. And I tried different combinations of browsers. With a paid account, you could try more, but I was unsuccessful at getting that. And as part of the sandbox execution, you could look into memory, CPU utilization, other process details. So obviously, if malware got installed, that would show up, but none of the indicators I saw suggested that they were trying to actually exploit that AnyRun image.
I see. But okay, so I have maybe kind of a small question or a hard question. So what do you think is the monetization model here? Because it's quite easy to see this sort of spam or this sort of campaigns. I also myself sometimes, I think I actually have a list of users on Twitter that if I see something that is obviously a bot or something, I put it in a list just for research. But it's kind of hard to understand. For instance, in this case, you show what is their monetization model. How there? So you exploit kits could be something, but is that really that worth it to? I don't know. I have no idea.
That's an interesting question, and that's partly why earlier I was talking about the 3 phases of the campaign and why I was operating with the assumption that those were 3 different threat actor groups. Because the implications for the business model is that the people who operate the redirectors, I did the calculation, it's costing them about $1,300 a year in infrastructure costs. So that's basically the cost they have to make up. That gives us an idea for what they might need to charge to redirect to the 3rd stage, the people hosting these dirty Tinder sites or possibly exploit kit. And maybe I've seen in the past that we were calling it commoditization, that as an attacker you could purchase an exploit, you could purchase someone writing you the phishing email and then send it via someone else's infrastructure. So this seems to fit that commoditization model. I don't know that that's the case, but then as soon as they hit $1,300 in costs, they're basically the same at that point as any kind of ad content delivery network. Only criminal.
No, I totally understand, like the first layers, like they basically sell views, or they sell views, but the last layer is really hard to understand, because at the end, yes, there is those sketchy websites that they might ask you for credit card, and maybe one user out of 1 million will put credit card in, but is it really that common? Seems really probably it's common, otherwise they wouldn't do it. But
yeah, and that's the part of the attack that I also am the least comfortable with, that I understand least about currently. Specifically, that first website I saw, there was nothing. It was kind of like a Potemkin village. Like there was the website, but once I started pulling code off the server and looking behind it, like you could keep clicking the link via AnyRun. Don't browse to that site directly, but you could keep clicking the link and it would show you a different picture, but it was basically like repeating the same ad. Hey, what a dirty site, different picture. Oh, so dirty. But nothing was going on in the background. There was no way to get out of that kind of loop. So there was nothing beyond that facade of a web page. And I still don't understand what was going on, because they didn't seem to be exploiting me, but they didn't seem to be trying to really solicit anything from me either.
It's very likely you didn't have .gov in your domain name.
If possible, yeah. And as I mentioned, I think they were profiling browsers and looking up geocoding the IP addresses.
The other thing, actually, you mentioned it earlier, was the ad redirects around Tumblr. So there's a lot of money to be made in stealing ads. So this could be one of the avenues as well.
It could be.
Yeah, there was actually entire campaigns targeting Google and their ads. So I wouldn't be surprised if this has something to do with that.
Yeah, they could generate fake clicks on ads by exploiting you that go there, and you look like a legitimate viewer of an ad, and so they get some money through that. But I guess we don't know. Okay, I think we answer everything. Thank you to the speaker. And Jerry, do you want to add something?
No, I think we're in good shape. Thanks, Courtney.
Okay.
We appreciate you coming. Every time you've spoke at these seminars, it's been great. So we appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Thanks. Bye.
Okay, take care.